General Miley, head of the Joint Chiefs, saying that the Russian forces are being slaughtered over the last 21 days in Bakhmut. And some of those casualty rates are absolutely unbelievable. In fact, I think Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Minister, yesterday said 220,000 Russian soldiers dead or injured since the start of this conflict. And although we don't have the exact figures from Ukraine, very much significantly less from that. The other significant issues over the last 24 hours, a number of HIMARS, precision artillery strikes into Mariupol that was captured earlier on in the conflict, and also reports potentially into Crimea too. People are making views about potentially the much vaunted spring offensive and some what we'd call deep operations happening. We'll have to see about that. I think the other area of interest, we've got Signor Grossi, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station over the last 24 hours, saying, again, reiterating what a challenging place this is and how difficult it is. And with all the nuclear rhetoric at the moment, we've discussed the tactical nuclear weapons being moved into Belarus and a number of other issues. I've written about it, others have written about it. I still think it's a lot of bluff and bluster and shows of desperation, and we should not overly worry ourselves about it. A couple of other bits on the military. I've had a lot of very interesting meetings over the last 24 hours, and a couple of things I think to think about over the next few days or so. The first one, Gerasimov, the ground commander, approaching 100 days, a pretty disastrous 100 days. One's not entirely sure where the Russians can go next. He was there to replace Varkin, who had failed. Gerasimov has also failed. They are, and with others moving slightly away, and recorded over-recorded, overheard calls between oligarchs losing faith in Putin. Things seem to be on the slide. And the other bit, I'll just, before I stop and hand over, reports coming out of the recruitment the Russians are doing. Apparently they have a group of about 4 million people. They're recruiting people with low IQs, people who won't be noticed. If they disappear, that's orphans, that's people who are living ref. I mean, completely cynical. And nobody sort of from around Moscow or the other big cities. These are people way in the east. And I understand their life expectancy is about a week. Most of these recruits who are brought in with virtually no training are either killed or injured within a week and off the front line. And that backs up what the Joint Chiefs are saying, and also the casualty rates that Ben Wallace is saying. So a very interesting time, as we also know that a lot of modern Western armour is now grumbling around in Ukraine. So I'll just stop there. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Just very quickly, could I get your reaction to seeing the tanks arrive in Ukraine that previously you'd have presumably been hearing on Salisbury Plain, close to where you live, that you've talked to us about before, the experience of hearing the Ukrainians practice with the vehicles, and now they're there. It'd be good to hear your reaction, your thoughts on that, and just a quick sense of what impact this could have on the battlefront.
Well, I think there are a number of things to consider here, David and everybody, that they have arrived unhindered. It is, one expects the Russians have been doing all they can to try and what we call interdict the lines of communications, and they have failed. And the Poles uncovered a Russian spy ring over only the last couple of days. So the fact they've all got there with, not a picture from when they left Bovington a few weeks ago to when they arrived in Ukraine. And I understand from people who were training them that these people are they were really impressed. These people know what they're doing. They seem to be very competent, not just at learning how to drive Challenger 2, but also how to maneuver, use them. So this armoured manoeuvre that myself and Dom have spoken about over the last few months, the ability to operate with artillery and infantry and air power, I'm getting more and more confident they really know what they're doing. And with the Russians being so static, somebody down the road from here mentioned this morning, the Russians are fighting like the first half of the First World War, with no integration, no air power. So when you look at these modern Western tanks like Challenger and Leopard, you put it together with this combined arms manoeuvre that we think they're going to do. I think they're going to have a pretty devastating effect. Now, they're going to be concentrated. They'll concentrate that Western armour to punch through in good old sort of terminology that we use in the military, the Schwerpunkt, the shock action, and then to get behind the enemy, get behind the Russians. And let's not forget, they've got a lot of old Russian tanks and armour as well that can flow through. So from looking at them on the ground, and there's a morale point here. It's very good psychologically for the Ukrainian morale and very bad. There is no morale in the Russian army. We've seen that. We know that they have people, regulars behind the front line who are shooting anybody who turns around. So there is no morale. So I would hope and expect that these modern Western tanks, allied with the HIMARS and everything else, are going to have a significant impact. But I think the Ukrainians are going to be very canny. We don't really know what they're doing. They've got all this armour there without the general public finding out. The next few months going to be interesting, and certainly one doesn't want to give any ideas to the Russians, but I think myself and others are pretty confident they're going to do the business.
Thank you very much, Hamish. We'll come back to you later, I think. I've got a few more questions, but it'd be great to hear from our guests, Maria and Harriet. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to turn to a completely different topic, really. Maria, you've joined us before to talk about the Ukrainian experience in the United Kingdom, specifically in Manchester, where you're living. One of the big pieces of news over the last 12 months, and longer really for us Brits, has been the cost of living crisis. It's been a really big thing. If people listening in from the States or from elsewhere, it's really a thing that's dominated the news. Inflation is going up, rent is going up. And I wanted to bring you and Harriet on just to talk about your experiences dealing with this. So just Maria first, maybe. As we've said, big thing in the UK, the cost of living crisis. How has it affected the Ukrainians who have settled here?
Thank you. Well, obviously it affects everybody, and it affects the Ukrainians who have settled here, but also their hosts. So in terms of the hosts, that they receive the standard £350 per month, and that's irrespective of whether they look after one or a big family of Ukrainians. And in year 2, that rises to £500. Some local authorities, of course, are opting to supplement this figure. And there have been a number of concerns that this figure simply doesn't cover the cost of household bills due to the significant increase. And whilst finance isn't often the main motivator, there also isn't necessarily the inclination to lose money while hosting Ukrainians. And of course, hosts can ask guests to contribute to bills, but often they feel uncomfortable because they know that Ukrainians are on low income and they need to save money in order to move on to their own accommodation in the future. And the combination of this has led to a number of hosting relationships breaking down. And for Ukrainians specifically, the issues that they face are around 2 issues. The first is heating and the costs for hosts. So in Ukraine, heating is centrally controlled, and it normally comes on in October and it's turned off in April. So you pay a set amount based on the size of your property and a number of people registered to live at that property. And as a result of this, Ukrainian properties are often well heated throughout the winter and to a decent temperature. And that's obviously not financially feasible in the UK, so Ukrainians are often cold when they're here in the UK. They also often on universal credit or they get low-paid jobs, and so any price rises have a huge automatic knock-on effect. And they also don't necessarily have access to savings to rely on. And those savings that they had, they would see them decline by 20% because of the change in the exchange rate. And there is further pressure on Ukrainians to send money home to support families back in Ukraine, as obviously Ukraine's unemployment has hugely increased in the last year and people are struggling there.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'll come back to you in a moment, but Harriet Marsden, can I bring you in here? You've had a personal experience to do with what we've just been talking about. Can you talk us through your story?
Hi. So I have been hosting now since the beginning of last May. So I signed up on the first day when the scheme first opened. And although I have been incredibly lucky in how well I get on with my guest, and we have a lot in common, both young women working from home, alone, self-employed, we have encountered so much difficulty with this scheme that actually I'm surprised that more host guest arrangements haven't broken down. And already we know of, as Maria was saying, I think the estimates now are approximately between 10 and 20%. The scheme has been, for want of a better word, a complete shambles. For 3 reasons. Firstly, in the beginning, there was the bureaucracy, the difficulty of doing things like the applications for the BRP, national insurance number. The job centre alone was a complete nightmare. The universal credit system just unworkable really for arriving refugees. So the bureaucratic aspect and in terms of money as well, lost income accompanying her to all of these appointments and helping with all these applications was enormous. Then there was the lack of support. So there was no way to be connected with any other hosts. The council were overwhelmed and frankly were useless anyway. The Refugee Council stepped in quite a bit later, and although they were amazing, we waited about 6 months for that help. And so there was no way to even know who else was hosting and to ask for help or advice from anything. I tried calling the DWP, the Home Office. I got completely conflicting information from everywhere. The job centre it was a joke. And then finally, the psychological aspect, which involved taking in someone who was extremely traumatized and trying to help them deal with everything here and assimilate, and not being trained or prepared in any way to do that. And the emotional burden of feeling responsible for your guests, feeling like you had signed up to give a room, but turning into an unpaid and untrained caseworker. So despite all of that, I've been extremely lucky, but I know of more people that have been unlucky and more guests that have been unlucky with this scheme than those who have been lucky.
Thanks, Harriet. Just staying with you for a moment, could you talk a little bit about what she's doing now and how the rise in inflation and as we've all seen, I think, especially renting in London, the increase in rent, how has that impacted her?
Oh, hugely. I mean, her plan originally was, after spending a year with me, to stay on in London and to rent privately. That is completely impossible, not only because of a lack of income, or she doesn't have enough income. Even if she got the full universal credit housing benefits as a young woman without any dependents, she really doesn't have a chance financially. But also with the London rental situation being what it is, she didn't even get a look in to even view flats, I mean, because she has to declare that she's on benefits, she doesn't have any rental history, she doesn't have a guarantor, she doesn't have a massive deposit, and her English, while good, isn't fluent. All of those things meant that not only can she not rent a flat in London, so she didn't even get a single appointment to see one. So she's actually now decided that she is moving to Poland, where she will be able to afford groceries and afford a flat and be able to get a job and be able to work and live in a way that she has not found possible here. And it's devastating for her.
That's an extremely sad story. Maria, would you like to come in on that? Does Harriet's experience kind of chime with you a little bit? Do you see similarities in the details there?
Yeah, I think she described it really well. The main issue is obviously that Ukrainians here are either in low-paid employment or no employment at all. And with the language provision that's been given by the government, the level that they need to get to in order to get a sort of decently paid job will take them years. And I know there's from hosting my mum as well. Obviously, some local authorities are handling this a bit better. London has always been a big problem, and the other problem is that a lot of Ukrainians seem to think that all the jobs and all the opportunities are in London. So when they look to come to the UK, they search for hosts in London because, like in Ukraine and many other countries, the capital is always the go-to place. But that's obviously not the case in the UK. A lot of cities, including Manchester, where I am, have a lot of opportunities. Housing, yeah, it's obviously the private rental prices have increased at 4.5% in the last 12 months. But at the same time, the housing element has not increased. So this creates a lot of issues that Harriet has described. And obviously the requirement for deposit and credit check and work history, that's making it more complicated. In my area, there's been sufficient help. So my mum's been able to move on to a private accommodation that is covered by her housing element of her universal credit. So they've been doing quite a fantastic job by approaching private landlords and asking them to agree to being paid through universal credit. So that's how they handle it here. And that's actually been working pretty well. And I've come into contact with several Ukrainians who've been able to move on privately. But obviously I live in Stockport, which is a lot smaller than London.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maria and Harriet. I mean, the reason I wanted to talk about this is partly because obviously, as journalists, we all have eyes on this because we're based in the UK. We're based in London. Maria, you're up in Manchester. So I would say to our listeners, if we are very interested about the experience of Ukrainians across the world, wherever they've gone to, because it feels like it's an incredibly important story. It feels like it got a lot of coverage and we want to keep up the pressure there and talk about some of the issues, the good and the bad that they're facing. So today, obviously, we're talking about the experience in Britain, but please do get in touch if you know of stories from where you are, from where you're listening. Harriet, can I come to you? You've described very eloquently and passionately the the issues and the problems faced by your guest. Would you tell us a little bit more about maybe some of the more positive aspects? You said it's been a pleasure to welcome her and to help her. Could you talk to us maybe a little bit about the positive sides of the last year?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely don't want to only focus on the negatives. I mean, getting to know someone who has been coming from that kind of background and everything that's going on in Ukraine has been really invaluable in terms of humanizing such an incomprehensible, the scale of the disaster and the scale of the trauma. Being able to get to know someone on a personal level day in, day out, and hear about her family and her friends, both back in Ukraine and also who have gone elsewhere, has been just an amazing insight, and also just such a great exchange of culture as well. Like, we've had Ukrainian cooking nights, I've taken her to all the museums. Ukrainian humor, as I've experienced it, is incredibly dry, witty, they're very funny, very direct. So being able to kind of introduce her to my culture and also hear and experience a bit of hers has been incredible.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Harriet. What did you present as the sort of best of British, may I ask?
Well, we have quite different interests, so I didn't really go in hard on the pub side of things because she's very much more interested in gaming and art and science. So we did like Natural History Museum, Science Museum, did the Jurassic Park exhibition, which is great. I took her to see Wicked and the Harry Potter musicals as well. She's very into magic. Went to the Tower of London. We got food poisoning at Wagamama's, so that was interesting. Just it's been really enriching in that way, I think, for both of us, and also probably very good for me as a journalist to be able to really experience in depth what it's actually like as a refugee to arrive here, even in these specific special circumstances with a lot of public sympathy, and the absolutely Kafkaesque nightmare that was the job centre situation has been really valuable to me as a journalist too.
Thank you, Harriet. Yeah, I mean, food poisoning at Wagamama is really the height of British cultural experience. Maria and Harriet, can I ask you both? We've talked a lot about some of the issues faced, and it's been interesting to hear that, it does sound, from Maria, what you said, that different local authorities are sort of, some are quite good, some really struggle. What, in both of your view, what do you think, what should the government be doing? What could be done now to help these people who are suffering from things like the cost of living crisis, seeing their rent go up? Are there things that, from your experience, that you'd recommend, Maria and Harriet? Maybe, Maria, would you like to take that first?
Yes, well, definitely. We know that there used to be over £10,000 provision of funding for every Ukrainian adult, and then it's slightly smaller for children. And to this day, I still haven't figured out where does that money go. And when you ask specifically, like my mom needed a dentist last summer. She had a tooth fall out, so it was quite serious, but she couldn't find a dentist here, without paying privately, which nobody can afford. And we were like, well, we have this money. Can we use it for a dentist? And we were told, no, you can't. So you just can't pick and choose where this money goes. And nobody really knows where exactly it goes. So that's quite sad because from my experience, a lot of Ukrainians have individual needs. They need something for the children, for example, or they need dental care, and it's just impossible to control how that money is spent. And same with housing, as we discussed earlier. There's a lot of Ukrainians who go through a homelessness route, and homelessness route costs loads and loads for the governments and for local authorities. And it takes a while to find, and Ukrainians are put up in hotels for months and months, and it takes a long time to find housing. But some Ukrainians even told me, like, if they gave this money that they use for these hotels to us, we would have been able to find something already ourselves. It's just that they can't control how the money is used. Obviously, the English lessons is a big one. My mom arrived here and she was offered 2 half days per week of English classes. As I said, we calculate that would take her like 2 or 3 years to get to the level that's good enough to be hired anywhere in customer-facing positions. She had the time. She was able to attend full-time lessons, but she was just, there was no way of getting more lessons. So that would definitely help Ukrainians to be more confident in speaking English if they had more language provision. I would say, as I said before, maybe some sort of advertisement to tell Ukrainians don't go to London, because London is really expensive. As Harriet has been pointing out, that there are opportunities outside of London. There's work opportunities, there's housing opportunities. And there is still obviously some resentment from me in terms of how the UK is the only country in Europe that requires visas for Ukrainians to come here. I guess looking at how the government is failing to handle and house asylum seekers, it's unrealistic to expect that this will change. And as for the community, I look at what I'm doing to help Ukrainians settle in here, and without blowing my own trumpet, I hope that it might inspire others to do the same in their areas. So I run free walking tours of Manchester for Ukrainians. The next one is this Sunday. That's been incredibly popular so far. I will have introduced 15% of Ukrainians in Greater Manchester to the city. And I'm planning to do this in Liverpool as well around Eurovision time. So, people can do things like this. This helps people settle in. And there's been a lot of interest, as I said. We met up with Lancashire Cricket Club earlier this week, and we talked about doing some sort of fun day or sports day for Ukrainians where the Ukrainian kids can learn cricket. And that's obviously the height of British culture. And that was actually inspired by our previous time I was on the Telegraph podcast where we discussed the scone and jam and clotted cream sort of challenge for Ukrainians. So for any community, get involved in making Ukrainians feel welcome, the bright, the bold, the wacky, just maybe not so much of the queuing or the food poisoning at Wagamamas.
Thank you, Maria. Harriet, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Maria is absolutely right. The question of where all this money has gone and what it's being spent on is a huge, huge, huge question mark. I know that there was a village that had a local authority that had taken three guests in the area, and it hasn't yet been satisfactorily explained what they've done with the rest of the money that they've received, because it's certainly nothing to the tune of the total that they've received of each borough, each local authority. I have no idea what they're doing with the money. We had a similar situation with an emergency dental appointment that we couldn't get and then we couldn't pay for. No support from the council for that, no support from the government either. I'd probably say that the most important thing the government could be doing is consistency of communication and information. I mean, we've had information coming in drips and drabs, and there's this press release and that's announced in the news, but then this is a rumour on the Facebook groups, but then that's come from the council, but then that's been clarified by the Refugee Council, and nobody seems to know what is going on. At any point, nobody has had a clear idea of where this scheme has been going, what the problems are going to be, or what the provisions for those problems will be. So communication is really important. I mean, what I've been hearing from my council, my borough, over and over again is we're waiting on central government. We don't know about central government. We haven't heard anything. So that's a problem. I also think that the fact that the Refugee Council will be withdrawing their support now is really going to be a huge problem. They've been much, much more helpful and supportive than either the government or local authority. And it's also, I don't know if we've spoken about this before, but the scheme has in fact been closed by the back door very quietly, which I don't know if a lot of people know. They've increased the monthly payments from 350 to 500, but only for a household that is hosting a guest that's already been in the country for 12 months or more, which is to say that it's been disincentivized to take a new refugee, which means there's no way that anybody would want to take on the burden of supporting a new guest in the country with all of its associated bureaucracy and appointments, and also receive nearly half of what someone else would be receiving for a guest that was here already and has assimilated, probably knows the language better, maybe has a job, is set up with BRP and NI number and everything. So that's a huge problem, particularly as there's a lot of tension among hosts, with all the different local authorities giving different winter payments, different cost of living payments, now different support payments as well. It's created unnecessary tension and competition. So I think, consistency and communication and an explanation of where the money has gone.
Well, thank you, Maria and Harriet. Just to repeat, this is, of course, an episode devoted really just to understanding some of the issues in the UK and in England, Maria in Manchester and Harriet in London. But of course, listeners, if you see things, please do let us know what's happening in your country. It's a story which we really want to stay on top of. It's very important to us. So do let us know what's happening in your country as well. Just to finish, Maria, you were at England-Ukraine, the Euros qualifying match last Sunday. It'd be really, really good to know what you made of it, your trip down to Wembley, and what was it like sitting in the Ukrainian crowd?
Oh, it was absolutely fantastic to be, both pre-match, there was a gathering at a pub near Wembley Stadium of Ukrainians, and it was a fantastic atmosphere there, lots of singing, lots of shouting, some drinking only a little bit. Then at the stadium itself, we had over 4,000 Ukrainian fans. It was great to see that 1,000 refugees were given free tickets as well. I was sat in the Ukraine sector with the over 4,000 Ukrainians who paid, or people who supported Ukraine. The atmosphere, I would say, was more relaxed than it was in the matches against Scotland and Wales that I attended last summer. It was fantastic to have been able to sing Ukrainian songs and to hear the national anthem of Ukraine sung at Wembley. It definitely brought a tear to my eye and was respected by the England fans. And I think there was a lot of mutual respect between the two. I saw definitely a lot of half and half scarves, which I think are normally frowned upon. But I saw English people just buying them and sporting them. And that was great. The match itself was obviously quite a disappointment with the result. And I was even more disappointed with the performance itself. There were some Ukrainian stars that definitely could have delivered more, such as Mudryk. He was poor like the others. But it was also Ruslan Vatan's debut as temporary manager of Ukraine team. We don't know how long. We know that Rebrov is supposed to step in, but we don't know how soon. But I know that Ruslan Vatan is not really supposed to be staying there for a while. So hopefully under the next manager, Ukraine will show a much better performance.
Well, thank you very much, Maria and Harriet. Well, let's go to our final thoughts. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, you've been listening to all of that. It'd be interesting to hear your reaction to it, but also to hear what you'll be looking at over the next few days and what's occupying your mind when looking at the battlefront.
Thank you. Well, absolutely fascinating. And, some of the issues that the people who've come over here are suffering is shocking. And I hope the government's listening and make sure that our friends from Ukraine who we're looking after, we help their military get rid of Putin, are properly looked after and want for nothing. And just sort of moving on to my sort of final thoughts, there are two things I just want to briefly cover. I rather glibly dismiss the nuclear threat, and that bears a little bit of an explanation. I think particularly if anybody's seen the piece on the BBC website today, an interview with Dmitry Muratov, who is a Nobel winner and journalist, talking very much about he was a bit concerned about Putin and whether he would press the red button or not. I think the reason that I'm pretty demonstrative that he won't is because he has used the nuclear issue to keep NATO out of the Ukraine fight. And it clearly hasn't worked, or it has worked that the fact that there are not NATO boots on the ground. And he absolutely knows that if he does do something nuclear, then NATO will get fully involved. NATO has the precision strike, the missiles, etc., to really finish off the Russian military and hence finish off Putin. That's why I am confident that we will not go nuclear. And that sort of leads on to my final point. Again, from interesting discussions I've had around town over the last 24 hours, that the Russian military is decimated and it's going to take it decades to get back. 1,900 tanks destroyed, at least in the last 13 months. It would appear they're pretty much out of precision-guided weaponry. The view that they're even having to take electronics out of washing machines to try and cobble together stuff, I think that is very significant. And at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, they are using First World War tactics. They have these allegedly 4 million people who that they're prepared to throw at the problem. And the final piece here is the Russian Air Force. Where is the Russian Air Force? It just hasn't performed. It just hasn't got involved. And, everybody talks about air power being the overriding power in these sort of conflicts. And to me, the only thing that Putin has left, really, at the end of this is possibly his Air Force. We know the Russian Navy is in a shocking state as well. So when puts all that together, I think if we see the Russian Air Force appear over the next few weeks or so, I would be surprised. And I think it is really it'll be the Ukrainians who decide this. And no doubt at some time there will be negotiations on where we go. But we're in a much better position. The Ukrainians much better position than perhaps they were 12 months ago. And as I reiterate, we are very confident in their capability and the Ukrainian military capability to push this forward, get on the front foot, and hopefully bring this dreadful war to a close as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Harriet Marston, what are your final thoughts?
Just to reiterate what's been said before, really, I think that the courage and the spirit and the capability shown by the Ukrainian people, both here and in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world, has been incredible and should be celebrated, no matter how much that it's important that we talk about the negatives and the devastation and the catastrophe that is this war and this displacement of people. I think it's really valuable to note just how much of an incredible fight, both in terms of military and in terms of the psychology and the strength that is being demonstrated by Ukrainians is incredible.
So, Security Minister Tom Tugendhat, thank you so much for making time to chat to the Telegraph. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to talk a bit about your announcement about the government's open source intelligence hub and taking a bit of Ukraine, a bit of intelligence more broadly. But first things first, I presume it's a prerequisite of your job as Security Minister that you have to be a massive James Bond fan. Inspector, you'll remember Andrew Scott, the evil C, trying to put together this intelligence hub that sucks open source data from around the world to turn into product. How is the open source intelligence hub that the government's announced any different from that, and who controls the moral compass?
So the reality is that there is already an enormous amount of data online. We all know that the number of photographs that people are putting on Facebook or Instagram, the number of messages that people are putting on Twitter, and of course the number of blogs. I don't know how many of your colleagues have started a Substack in recent years. There's an absolute ton of information that's out there. There's also, of course, a ton of information that's out there from satellite photographs. We're used to Google Earth, but there are actually many others out there nowadays. And there's a whole series of ways in which people are putting information out there. So this isn't a question of the government sucking everything in, but rather understanding what's already out there. The reality is that intelligence has changed. We started off, when was it, 500, 600, 700 years ago, maybe even a few thousand years ago, with intelligence looking into different people around the world. And we got into human intelligence, and of course our classic division is MI5 and MI6, home and abroad, if you like. And the first major evolution was the Government Communications and Cipher School, which became GCHQ. That was when we were telegram native, if you like. Well, now we've got to be digital native. We've got to look at the reality that intelligence, the information that is publicly available, is the sort of thing that we need to be understanding to make sure that we're fully informed.
We will talk about the benefits of AI